Before getting into today's stories, let me know where everyone is from and what time so we can send wishes of health and luck to you and your relatives and friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos of our channel. Thank you very much, everyone. Let's get started. Story 1. It was my first week working the night shift as a technician at St. Bryns Hospital in Northern Wales. St. Bryns was a massive, labyrinthine building that dated back to the late 1800s, with countless extensions and renovations over the years. I'd been warned about how eerie it could feel during the graveyard shift, but I brushed it off as overactive imaginations. That night, I'd learned how wrong I was. The shift began uneventfully, with a trickle of patients for routine imaging and a handful of emergencies. Around 2 a.m., during my break, I decided to take a shortcut through the hospital's lower tunnels, a network of old service corridors used to move equipment and supplies. I'd heard the usual tales of ghostly sightings and unexplained noises down there, but I wasn't the type to scare easily. Besides, it was the quickest way to the staff lounge. As I descended the stairs, the air grew cooler and carried a faint metallic tang. The dim overhead lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows along the corridor. My footsteps echoed unnervingly, as though the sound was being mirrored by someone just out of sight. I tightened my grip on my flashlight and walked faster. Halfway through the tunnel, I heard a faint voice behind me, like someone whispering my name. "Eve!" it hissed. My heart skipped a beat. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer, just the faint hum of the ventilation system. I shook my head and muttered, "Get a grip, Eve." "It's just your imagination." I turned a corner and nearly collided with a man in a janitor's uniform. He looked startled but quickly smiled. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice gravelly. "No worries," I replied, forcing a laugh. "I wasn't expecting anyone down here." "You're heading to the staff lounge?" he asked. "Yeah, taking the shortcut." He hesitated, his expression darkening. "Be careful. These tunnels, they're not always safe at night." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He glanced over his shoulder, as if checking for something. "Strange things happen down here. People hear voices, see shadows that don't belong to anyone. Some even say the tunnels shift, leading you somewhere you don't want to be." I forced a smile, though my stomach churned. "Sounds like a ghost story." His gaze locked onto mine, unblinking. "Just watch your back." Before I could ask more, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Uneasy, I continued my journey, the sound of my footsteps now joined by the faint scuffing of shoes behind me. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but the corridor was empty. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed down the tunnel, followed by a scraping noise that sent chills down my spine. I broke into a run, my pulse pounding in my ears. I just reached a set of double doors when I heard the whisper again, louder this time. "Eve, come back." I pushed through the doors and found myself in an unfamiliar section of the tunnels. The air felt heavier here, thick with the smell of damp concrete and decay. Old hospital beds and wheelchairs lined the walls, their rusting frames like skeletal remains. I realized I was completely lost. "Damn it," I muttered, pulling out my phone to check the map. No signal. "Lost?" a voice said behind me. I spun around to see a woman in an outdated nurse's uniform standing a few feet away. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed, but she smiled faintly. "Oh, thank God," I said, relief flooding me. "Can you help me get back to the elevators?" She tilted her head, her smile widening unnaturally. "Follow me," she said, turning and walking down the corridor. Her footsteps made no sound. Unease prickled at the back of my neck, but I followed her. "How long have you worked here?" I asked, trying to make conversation to calm my nerves. "A long time," she replied without looking back. "You must know these tunnels well," I said, glancing at the rusted beds and peeling paint. "They're creepy." She chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "They've always been like this. Forgotten like me." Her words sent a chill through me. "Forgotten? What do you mean?" She stopped suddenly and turned to face me. Her eyes were dark, her smile gone. "Why are you here, Eve?" I blinked. I'm on my break. I just needed to get to the lounge." Her gaze seemed to pierce through me. "This is no place for a break. You should leave." "That's what I'm trying to do," I said, taking a step back. "Can you just point me to the elevators?" She tilted her head again, her expression unreadable. "There's only one way out now." Before I could respond, the lights flickered violently, and when they stabilized, she was gone. The door she had led me to creaked open on its own, revealing a pitch-black void. From within came a low growl, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. I turned and ran, the growling and dragging noises growing louder behind me. I didn't stop until I burst into the brightly lit staff lounge, gasping for breath. One of my coworkers looked up from their coffee, startled. "Eve, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I managed a shaky laugh. "Maybe I have." The next day, I asked around about the woman in the old nurse's uniform. An older staff member pulled me aside and whispered, "You saw her? That's Eleanor. She worked here in the 70s and went missing one night. Some say she never left. I never took the tunnels again, but even now, I can't shake the feeling that Eleanor is still down there, waiting for someone else to get lost in her domain." Story 2. The Night Watch. I worked the night shift at an old, sprawling care home tucked away in the English countryside. The building had a history, originally a sanatorium in the 1800s before becoming a care facility. Stories of strange occurrences were whispered among staff, but I dismissed them as overactive imaginations, until I couldn't anymore. It began subtly. I'd hear faint humming while making rounds, the kind of soft tune you'd associate with a lullaby. It always seemed to come from just around the corner, but when I'd turn, the hallway would be empty. One night, as I checked on a resident, the music box on her nightstand started playing by itself. "Did you wind this?" I asked my coworker Sarah as she passed by. "No," she said, frowning. "It's broken, isn't it?" I didn't answer, but the melody stayed in my head long after it stopped. A few weeks later, I was assigned to assist Mr. Dawson, one of the more lucid residents. He'd always talk about the boy in the walls. "He runs when you're not looking," Mr. Dawson said, staring at a crack in the plaster. "Likes to hide, likes to watch." "Let's get you back to bed," I said, brushing it off. But that night I saw movement in the corner of my eye. Something small darting down the hall. I chased after it, thinking it was an animal, but found nothing. Sarah and I started noticing a pattern. Whenever staff members argued or spoke negatively, strange things would happen. Lights would flicker, chairs would scrape across floors, or cold gusts would sweep through closed rooms. One night, while venting about our workload in the staff room, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. "Enough!" Sarah snapped, half joking, half angry. But then we heard it, a soft, childlike giggle. "Who's there?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling. Her hand hovered over the walkie-talkie clipped to her waist. "Don't," I whispered. "What if it's—" I trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. What if it's what? A ghost? A trick of the mind? The giggle came again, this time from behind us. We spun around only to find the room empty. The air felt heavier, as if something unseen was watching us. "Stop playing games," Sarah muttered, her voice shaking. "What if it's not a game?" I replied. The following week, we discovered a new kind of horror. I was helping Sarah organize the linen closet when we heard heavy breathing coming from the hallway. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my pulse quickening. She nodded, and we both stepped into the corridor. It was empty except for a shadow stretching unnaturally long from the corner. We froze as the shadow seemed to ripple, almost as if it were alive. "It's him," Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "The thing the others talk about, the one that follows." Before I could ask her to explain, the shadow shot forward, disappearing into the wall. We didn't speak for the rest of the night. The worst night came when we decided to investigate the locked attic. Rumors swirled about what was up there. Old patient records, forgotten belongings, maybe even the source of the disturbances. Armed with flashlights, Sarah and I climbed the creaky staircase. "Why do I feel like we shouldn't be here?" Sarah asked, hesitating at the top step. "Because we shouldn't," I replied, but pushed open the door anyway. The room was dusty and cluttered with old furniture and boxes, but what caught our attention was a mirror leaning against the far wall. It was ornate, with a tarnished gold frame, and so large it reflected almost the entire room. That's creepy, Sarah muttered. Do you see that? I asked, pointing to the reflection. A figure stood behind us, just barely visible in the dim light. It was a boy, no older than 10, with hollow eyes and a faint, haunting smile. Don't move, Sarah whispered. What do you mean, don't move? I hissed. He's looking right at you. I spun around, but no one was there. Let's leave, Sarah whispered, pulling my arm. As we turned to go, the reflection in the mirror changed. The boy was gone, replaced by a woman with long, dark hair, her face obscured by shadows, her hand pressed against the glass as if trying to reach through. Do you see that? I asked, my voice trembling. Sarah didn't reply. She was staring at the mirror, frozen in fear. The woman's hand began to move, slowly sliding down the glass, leaving behind streaks that looked like blood. Run, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. What? Run, she screamed, yanking me toward the door. We bolted down the stairs, but as we reached the bottom, the humming started again. It followed us all the way back to the staff room, growing louder and louder until it was almost deafening. I left the care home shortly after that night. Sarah and I never spoke of the attic again, though we both saw the same thing in that mirror. I've thought about going back, if only to find out who or what was trying to reach us. But every time I consider it, I hear that haunting lullaby. And I know some doors are better left closed. Story 3. I've been a night guard for 3 years now, and 2 years ago I had the pleasure of working in the sprawling Von Elrich Estate Museum on the outskirts of Frankfurt, Germany. This place wasn't your typical museum. It housed rare artifacts, ancient sculptures, and tapestries that seemed older than time itself. The estate was renowned for its unsettling atmosphere, but for someone like me, it sounded like an easy gig. Silence, solitude, and a paycheck. At least that's what I thought at first. Another night in the crypt, huh? My coworker Martin joked as I clocked in for the 10 p.m. shift. Yeah, maybe I'll finally meet the ghost everyone keeps talking about. I chuckled, half joking, but Martin's expression shifted. Don't say that, he muttered, avoiding my eyes. I raised an eyebrow. What's with you, man? You've been jumpy all week. It's nothing. Just don't go into the East Wing alone tonight, okay? I smirked, thinking he was playing a prank. Right. Got it. East Wing is haunted. Stay away. Blah, blah. Anything else? Martin didn't laugh. He just gave me a long, almost pitying look before heading out. By midnight, I was doing my rounds. The museum was eerily quiet as usual, but something felt different. The air was heavier, almost suffocating. When I entered the East Wing, despite Martin's warning, I noticed how the shadows seemed darker, deeper, as if they were alive. Then I reached the Gallery of the Nameless. It was filled with unmarked relics, a cracked mirror, a headless statue, and a series of paintings so faded you could barely make out the figures. As I passed one painting, a dark, abstract canvas smeared with reds and blacks, I noticed something odd. The surface seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen breeze. I stopped, my flashlight trembling slightly. Just shadows, I muttered to myself. Or not, a voice whispered behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. No one. The hallway was empty, but the air felt charged. Martin, you there? I radioed, trying to sound calm. Static. Then faintly, get out of there, now. What? Why? Just trust me, get out. His voice was shaky, almost pleading. Martin, stop messing around. What's going on? He didn't respond, but the static grew louder, like a faint, raspy breathing was crawling through the speaker. Then out of the silence, I heard a low whisper. Stay. My hands shook as I fumbled with the radio. Who is this? No answer. Against my better judgment, I turned back to the painting. As I leaned in, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, I saw movement, not my reflection, but something inside the canvas. A pale hand pressed against the surface, its fingers unnaturally long and clawed. Help! Us! A distorted voice whispered, barely audible but undeniably real. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The lights in the gallery flickered, then went out entirely. Martin! Lights are out in the East Wing! I shouted into the radio, panic rising. Static. Then his voice, faint and distant. You need to leave. Now. Martin, what the hell is going on? I yelled, my voice echoing in the empty gallery. This time, he replied, It's not safe in there. I've seen it too, okay? The painting. It's not just a painting, it's... He trailed off, his voice breaking. It's what? I demanded. It's alive, he said finally, his tone barely above a whisper. And it knows you're there. Before I could respond, an alarm blared, echoing through the empty halls. The monitor for the east wing lit up, showing the gallery. The painting I'd seen earlier was no longer on the wall. Instead, it was lying on the floor, its surface twisted and distorted, as if something had crawled out of it. Martin, you're watching the cameras, right? Tell me what's happening. Silence, then. You won't believe me if I tell you. Try me, he sighed, his voice trembling. There's something in the room with you. It's looking at the camera. It knows I'm watching. A chill ran down my spine. You're joking. I'm not. You need to move. Now. I didn't wait for him to say more. I bolted out of the gallery, heart racing. When I reached the main security office, Martin was already there, his face pale as chalk. You saw it, didn't you? He asked, his voice barely audible. What the hell is going on in this museum? I demanded. He hesitated before speaking. There's something in those paintings. People say they're cursed or... I don't know, but everyone who's worked here long enough has seen them move. Sometimes they whisper. Sometimes... He trailed off, glancing at the monitors. Sometimes what? I pressed. Sometimes they take people, he whispered. Before I could respond, the monitor flickered again. A figure, tall, gaunt, and cloaked in shadows, stalked through the gallery. It turned toward the camera, and for a brief moment, its hollow, glowing eyes stared directly at us. The monitor went black. Get your stuff. We're leaving, Martin said, his voice trembling. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. As we left, the announcement system crackled to life, playing a garbled recording of a woman's voice. Stay with us. Neither of us ever went back to the museum. A week later, it was shut down without explanation. Rumors swirled, missing staff, unexplained accidents, but no official statement was ever released. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of that painting. I see the hand, the eyes, and I hear the voice. Help us. And sometimes when I wake, I wonder if I ever truly left the gallery. Story 4. As I passed one painting, a dark, abstract canvas smeared with reds and blacks, I noticed something odd. The surface seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen breeze. I stopped, my flashlight trembling slightly. Just shadows, I muttered to myself. Or not, a voice whispered behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. No one. The hallway was empty, but the air felt charged. Martin, you there? I radioed, trying to sound calm. Static. Then faintly. Get out of there. Now. What? Why? Just trust me. Get out. His voice was shaky, almost pleading. Martin, stop messing around. What's going on? He didn't respond, but the static grew louder. Like a faint, raspy breathing was crawling through the speaker. Then out of the silence, I heard a low whisper. Stay. My hands shook as I fumbled with the radio. Who is this? No answer. Against my better judgment, I turned back to the painting. As I leaned in, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, I saw movement, not my reflection, but something inside the canvas. A pale hand pressed against the surface, its fingers unnaturally long and clawed. Help! Us! A distorted voice whispered, barely audible but undeniably real. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The lights in the gallery flickered, then went out entirely. Martin! Lights are out in the east wing! I shouted into the radio, panic rising. Static. Then his voice, faint and distant. You need to leave. Now. Martin, what the hell is going on? I yelled, my voice echoing in the empty gallery. This time he replied, It's not safe in there. I've seen it too, okay? The painting. It's not just a painting. It's... He trailed off, his voice breaking. It's what? I demanded. It's alive, he said finally, his tone barely above a whisper. And it knows you're there. Before I could respond, an alarm blared, echoing through the empty halls. The monitor for the east wing lit up, showing the gallery. The painting I'd seen earlier was no longer on the wall. Instead, it was lying on the floor, its surface twisted and distorted, as if something had crawled out of it. "Martin, you're watching the cameras, right? Tell me what's happening." Silence, then. "You won't believe me if I tell you." "Try me," he sighed, his voice trembling. "There's something in the room with you. It's looking at the camera. It knows I'm watching." A chill ran down my spine. "You're joking." "I'm not. You need to move. Now." I didn't wait for him to say more. I bolted out of the gallery, heart racing. When I reached the main security office, Martin was already there, his face pale as chalk. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What the hell is going on in this museum?" I demanded. He hesitated before speaking. "There's something in those paintings. People say they're cursed or I don't know. But everyone who's worked here long enough has seen them move. Sometimes they whisper, sometimes—" He trailed off, glancing at the monitors. "Sometimes what?" I pressed. "Sometimes they take people," he whispered. Before I could respond, the monitor flickered again. A figure, tall, gaunt, and cloaked in shadows, stalked through the gallery. It turned toward the camera, and for a brief moment, its hollow, glowing eyes stared directly at us. The monitor went black. "Get your stuff. We're leaving," Martin said, his voice trembling. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. As we left, the announcement system crackled to life, playing a garbled recording of a woman's voice. "Stay with us." Neither of us ever went back to the museum. A week later, it was shut down without explanation. Rumors swirled, missing staff, unexplained accidents, but no official statement was ever released. Sometimes late at night, I dream of that painting. I see the hand, the eyes, and I hear the voice. "Help us." And sometimes when I wake, I wonder if I ever truly left the gallery. Story 5. I recently started working the overnight shift from midnight to 10:30 a.m. at an old community shelter. My duties included security checks, monitoring the residents, and ensuring the building remained secure. On paper, it sounded straightforward. In reality, it wasn't. The shelter was a labyrinthine building with long, dimly lit hallways that seemed alive in their silence. My office had a window overlooking the back courtyard, a place where no one was supposed to be at night. But sometimes I saw movement, shadows flitting past, figures standing still under the weak glow of the single street lamp. Whenever I'd investigate, I found no one. On this particular night, I was paired with Grace, an older coworker who had worked there for years. She was sitting in the office sipping tea as I got ready for my first walkthrough. "You'll hear things," she warned without looking up. "Best not to pay too much attention." "What kind of things?" I asked, smirking to mask my unease. She set her tea down slowly and looked at me, her face solemn. "Footsteps where no one should be. Doors opening on their own. Whispers." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And if you're unlucky, you might see her." I felt a chill creep down my spine. "See who?" Grace leaned closer. "You don't want to know. Just stick to the main hallways, finish your rounds, and come straight back." Shrugging off her warning, I stepped into the hallway. It was deathly quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. The air was heavy, colder than usual. As I moved past the women's wing, I thought I heard soft murmurs behind one of the doors. I paused, pressing my ear to it. The whispers stopped abruptly. "Hello?" I called, tapping the door. No response. When I returned to the office, Grace looked up. "Hear anything?" "Someone was whispering in room 204, but when I checked—" "It's empty," she interrupted, her face darkening. "Has been for weeks." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Grace hesitated before speaking, her voice barely audible. "A woman stayed there once. She left under strange circumstances. That room hasn't been used since." Before I could press her for details, the power flickered. The lights dimmed, then went out entirely, plunging us into darkness. "Backup generators should kick in," Grace muttered, but her voice wavered. She grabbed a flashlight from the desk, its beam cutting through the black. "Come on, let's check the breakers." We walked down the hallway toward the maintenance room. The stillness was oppressive, broken only by the soft shuffle of our footsteps. As we turned a corner, Grace froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I strained my ears. A faint sound, like bare feet slapping against tile, echoed faintly from the end of the hall. "Stay here," I said, summoning courage I didn't feel. "No." Grace grabbed my arm, her grip like iron. "We stick together. You don't wander off when she's around." I stared at her. "Who's she?" "Grace, you're not making any sense." Grace didn't answer. Instead, she pressed forward, pulling me with her. As we rounded another corner, the flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing in the distance. A woman, her hair matted and hanging over her face, her head tilted unnaturally to the side. "Grace." "I know." Her voice was sharp. "Don't look at her. Just keep walking." My breath caught in my throat. "Why?" "Don't." Look, we walked past where the figure had been, but when I glanced over my shoulder, she was gone. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in. We reached the maintenance room, and Grace shoved the door open, slamming it behind us. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "She doesn't like it when people ask questions," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She doesn't like being noticed." "Grace, this is insane. Who is she?" Grace hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door. "She's the one who stayed in room 204, the one who never left. They found her here after she," her voice caught, "after she hanged herself. Some say she's still looking for the one who locked her in." The door creaked behind us, the handle rattling softly. "No," Grace whispered, backing away. "She can't be here. Not now." I grabbed her arm. "Who locked her in, Grace?" Her eyes met mine, filled with terror. "I don't know. No one knows. But she thinks we did." The rattling grew louder, turning into a violent pounding. "We have to go," Grace hissed, yanking me toward the door leading back to the main hallway. But as she opened it, the flashlight flickered out completely, plunging us into darkness. And in that darkness, a voice whispered, soft and chilling, "Why did you leave me?" The lights came back on, and I found myself alone in the hallway. Grace was gone. The only sound was the distant creak of a door swinging open at the end of the corridor. I never saw Grace again, but every night since I've heard her voice echoing in the halls, calling my name. And I know it's only a matter of time before she finds me. Story 6. I used to work the night shift at an old roadside inn, a place half forgotten by travelers and swallowed by the quiet of the woods surrounding it. It was late, around 11 p.m., when the door creaked open and an unsettling chill crept into the lobby. A woman shuffled in, her figure hunched and draped in a tattered cloak that looked as though it had survived centuries. She leaned heavily on a crooked cane, her head tilted as if listening for sounds no one else could hear. Her eyes, sharp and glinting, locked onto me. "Do you have any lantern oil?" she asked, her voice like brittle leaves. I blinked, caught off guard. "Lantern oil? Ma'am, this is an inn, not a general store. I don't think—" "Check," she interrupted, her voice firmer this time. There was a strange authority in her tone that made me hesitate. "Let me ask my manager," I replied, trying to hide the unease creeping up my spine. I walked to the back office where Tim, my manager, was dozing in his chair. "Hey, do we have lantern oil?" I asked, the words feeling absurd even as I said them. Tim frowned, rubbing his eyes. "Lantern oil? What is this? The 1800s? No, of course not. Who's asking?" "Just an older lady," I said, glancing back toward the lobby. But when I returned, she was gone. The air felt heavier, the room darker. I stepped outside, expecting to see her shuffling away. But the parking lot was empty. No cars, no footprints in the fresh layer of frost. When I returned, Tim was leaning against the doorframe, his brow furrowed. "Whoever it was, she's not here now," he said. "Weird." "She seemed insistent," I replied. "She kept staring at me, like she knew something I didn't. Honestly, it was unsettling." Tim shrugged. "Maybe she's one of those eccentric locals. Either way, she's gone now." "Yeah, but—" I hesitated, lowering my voice. "I swear, Tim, the way she looked at me, her eyes were too sharp, too alive. And her cane, it sounded like it was tapping right behind me even after she disappeared." Tim stared at me for a moment, then chuckled nervously. You've been working too many nights, buddy. Go splash some water on your face. I nodded, but the unease wouldn't shake. Tim, are you sure we've never had incidents here? You know, something strange? Tim's expression darkened briefly. Not that I know of, he said after a pause, but this place is old. People talk. You know how rumors go. Rumors? What kind of rumors? I pressed. Tim hesitated, glancing at the dimly lit lobby. Just stories. People say weird things happen here at night. Stuff moves, lights flicker. Sometimes people claim to see shadows where there shouldn't be any. But it's all nonsense. I didn't respond, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The rest of the night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, as I was heading out, I spotted an old photograph hanging in the inn's storage room. It was a group portrait of the original staff when the inn first opened in the 1920s. Among them stood a woman, stooped with a crooked cane and the same piercing eyes. My stomach dropped. Later that evening, I visited the town library to dig into the inn's history. The librarian, Mrs. Hendricks, was happy to help. When I showed her the photograph, her face paled. That's Margaret Hallow, she whispered. She was the original caretaker of the inn. Rumor has it she was odd, said to practice strange rituals. People claim she could summon spirits. What happened to her? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She disappeared one winter night, Mrs. Hendricks said. They never found her body, only her cane and some strange symbols carved into the floor of her room. I felt a cold sweat forming on my neck. The librarian leaned closer. Why do you ask? No reason, I lied, clutching my jacket tighter. That night, I worked my shift with my nerves on edge. Around midnight, the lights in the lobby began to flicker. Then the front door creaked open, though no one was there. A cold breeze swept in, carrying with it a faint whisper. Lantern oil, the voice rasped, almost imperceptibly. I froze, my eyes darting around the empty room. My breath caught in my throat as the whisper grew louder, overlapping with itself, as though a chorus of voices were chanting. Who's there? I shouted, my voice trembling. The only response was the sound of the cane tapping against the wooden floor, slow and deliberate. The noise circled me, though I could see no one. My heart pounded as I grabbed the nearest thing, a metal flashlight, and swung it wildly. The tapping stopped. When I turned back toward the desk, there it was, an old lantern sitting neatly on the counter, glowing faintly despite having no visible flame. Beside it lay a scrap of paper with a single word scrawled in jagged handwriting, soon. I quit the next morning. I've never gone back to the inn, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of a cane tapping on the pavement outside my window. And every so often, I find a small pool of oil in places it has no reason to be. Story 7. A few years ago, I worked the late shift at a small diner just outside of town. The place was old, built decades ago, and rumors swirled about its history. A fire that had once consumed part of the building, taking several lives with it. Most of us brushed off the stories as urban legends, but after that one night, I was no longer so sure. It was a slow Tuesday, the kind of night where time dripped by like syrup. My co-worker Matt and I were in charge of closing. The manager, Sarah, stayed in her office, buried in paperwork as usual. The night began normally. Matt and I took turns cleaning the kitchen and checking stock. Around 11 p.m., Matt called out from the back. Hey, Emily, did you just walk through the storage room? His voice echoed. I frowned. No, I've been here at the counter. Why? He appeared in the doorway, his face pale. I swear I saw someone go in there. A tall figure. Thought it was you. Maybe it was Sarah, I offered, though the hairs on my arm stood on end. Matt shook his head. Sarah's still in the office. I checked, we exchanged uneasy glances. Let's check it out together, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Grabbing a flashlight, we headed toward the storage room at the back of the diner. The air grew colder as we approached. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting unsettling shadows. Matt nudged open the storage room door. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. Inside, the room was silent, shelves stacked with cans and boxes. Nothing seemed out of place. See? I said, forcing a laugh. Probably just your imagination. Matt didn't look convinced. No, I'm telling you, I saw someone. They went right into this room. Well, they're not here now, I replied, glancing around nervously. Maybe they left. Matt crossed his arms, his eyes darting around the room. Left and locked the door behind them? Come on, Emily. That doesn't make sense. I hesitated. Okay, so what do you think you saw? It was tall, he said slowly, as if reliving the moment, and dark, like a shadow, but solid. I swear it looked right at me before turning into this room. You're creeping me out, I muttered, gripping the flashlight tighter. Let's just go. As we turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. What the hell? Matt yelled, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. Stop messing around, I snapped, though fear crept into my voice. I'm not, he shot back, still pulling at the door. It's stuck. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. Matt, I whispered, my voice trembling, turn it back on. I'm trying, he said through gritted teeth. It's not working. And that's when we heard it. A low whisper, barely audible at first, growing louder with each passing second. It was coming from the far corner of the room. Did you hear that? I whispered. Yeah, Matt replied, his voice shaking. Who's there? The whispering stopped. For a moment the room was silent, save for our ragged breaths. Then a faint chuckle echoed, followed by a dragging sound, something heavy being pulled across the floor. What is that? I hissed, gripping Matt's arm. I don't know, he replied, his eyes wide. Hello? Who's there? The dragging sound grew louder, closer. We both backed up until we hit the shelves behind us. This isn't funny, Matt yelled, his voice cracking. Show yourself! A deep guttural laugh filled the room, reverberating off the walls. The sound was unnatural, sending chills down my spine. Matt, we need to get out of here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm trying, he yelled, yanking at the door again. This time it flew open with such force that Matt stumbled backward. Standing in the doorway was Sarah, her face twisted in confusion. What's going on? She asked, flipping on the lights. The room was empty. No shadow, no whispers, nothing out of place. There was... Matt started but trailed off. Never mind. We left the storage room in silence, locking it behind us. Sarah gave us strange looks but didn't press further. As we cleaned up for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Later, as we were clocking out, Sarah stopped us. By the way, she said, who's that guy you were talking to in the storage room? I saw him on the security camera. What? Matt and I said in unison. Sarah turned the monitor toward us. The screen showed the storage room, and there we were, standing frozen in the corner. Behind us stood the shadowy figure, its hand resting on Matt's shoulder. The footage ended abruptly. Sarah frowned. The camera glitched right after that. Strange, huh? Neither of us said a word. We just grabbed our things and left, vowing never to take the closing shift again. But even now, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if the camera hadn't glitched? Story 8. When I was 17, I worked the late shift at Shadow Creek gas station, a lonely spot on the edge of town, surrounded by thick woods and a silence that felt alive. That night was colder than usual, and the heater inside barely worked. Around 1 a.m., the doorbell chimed. I looked up to see a man shuffle in. He wore tattered jeans and a heavy coat with the hood pulled low. His breath misted in the cold. But his face, what little I could see, was pale as if he hadn't been outside in years. He limped toward the coffee machine, muttering under his breath. His voice was gravelly, but I caught fragments. They're here, no doors, shadows everywhere. His hands trembled as he poured coffee, spilling some on the counter. When he approached the register, his eyes locked on mine. They were bloodshot and wild, darting around the store as if expecting something to leap out from the corners. You need to tell Abigail something for me, he rasped. Abigail? I frowned. Who's Abigail? She'll know, he said quickly, his voice rising slightly. Just tell her I said thank you. For what? I asked, unnerved. He leaned in closer, his face inches from mine. I could smell the stale coffee and cold sweat on him. For the warning, he shoved a crumpled dollar bill onto the counter, grabbed his coffee, and shuffled back out into the freezing night. His muttering faded as he disappeared into the darkness. 2 hours later, Abigail walked in, as she always did during her early morning routine. She was in her mid-30s with bright eyes and a friendly smile. "Morning, Abigail," I greeted her as I rang up her usual, a pack of gum and a lottery ticket. "Hey, some guy came in earlier and told me to say thank you to you." She froze mid-reach for her wallet. "What?" "Yeah," I said, shrugging. "I don't know who he was. He just said, 'Tell Abigail thank you.'" Her smile faded, replaced by confusion. "What did he look like?" when I tried to recall. Pale, kind of shaky, wore a big coat and muttered a lot. He said something about shadows." Before I could finish, Abigail's face turned ghostly white. She reached across the counter and grabbed my arm. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Yeah, I stammered. "What's going on?" She didn't answer me. Instead, she fumbled for her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed. "Lock the doors," she said into the phone. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the urgency in it made my skin crawl. "Don't let anyone in. I'm on my way home. Just lock everything." "Abigail, what's going on?" I pressed. She looked at me, her eyes wide and glassy with fear. "Did he touch you? Did he try to come back inside?" "No, he just left after buying coffee." Her breathing quickened. "Listen to me," she said, leaning closer. "If he comes back, don't talk to him. Don't even look at him. And whatever you do, don't let him in." She shoved some cash on the counter and bolted for the door. I stared after her, my heart pounding in my chest. The store felt colder, darker, as if something unseen was pressing in from the edges. Around 4 a.m., as the first faint hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, I stepped outside to change the trash bags. The woods behind the station loomed darker than usual, their silhouettes swaying unnaturally in the wind. I tried to shake off the unease. As I bent down to tie a trash bag, I heard footsteps behind me. "Abigail said you'd be here," a voice murmured. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I turned back toward the door, but the voice came again, closer this time. "Tell Abigail. The shadows followed her home." My heart was pounding as I ran back inside and locked the doors. I glanced around the store, expecting to see something or someone, but there was only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. The next day, Abigail returned. She looked exhausted, her eyes ringed with dark circles, as if she hadn't slept all night. I wasted no time. "Who was he?" I demanded. "What's going on?" She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the dark woods outside. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she said quietly. "Try me," I insisted. She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man you saw, he's been dead for 3 years." I froze, my blood turning to ice. "What?" "He died after he saw them," she continued, her voice shaking. "The shadows. They're not human, and once they've noticed you—" She trailed off, staring at me with an expression of pity. "What do you mean, noticed me?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. She shook her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered, before turning and leaving the store. That was the last time I saw her. A week later, I heard she'd disappeared. Her house was found abandoned, the front door left wide open. On the wall, written in blackened ash, were the words, "They're here." Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the man's voice whispering to me in the dark. "The shadows followed you next." Story 9. My first job out of high school was as a night guard for an old, decaying furniture warehouse on the edge of a quiet town. The place had a dark reputation. It was once a vibrant manufacturing site, but after a tragic fire decades ago that claimed multiple lives, it had been left to rot. It was said the shadows of those who perished lingered. I didn't pay much attention to the rumors. The job was simple. Check the perimeter, log my rounds, and keep watch. The warehouse was massive, with labyrinthine hallways, towering stacks of forgotten furniture, and an eerie stillness that made every sound seem unnaturally loud. One night, a storm was raging outside. Rain lashed against the windows and lightning illuminated the skeletal remains of the once bustling factory floor. I was halfway through my rounds when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic knocking sound, like knuckles rapping on hollow wood. "Who's there?" I called, my voice echoing into the void. There was no reply, but the knocking grew louder. It seemed to be coming from a corridor that led to a disused storage room. The air grew colder as I approached, my flashlight barely piercing the oppressive darkness. I found the source. an old wooden door that hadn't been opened in years. The knocking abruptly stopped as I reached for the handle. My breath caught in my throat. "Don't open it," a voice whispered, low and hoarse. Behind me, I spun around, my flashlight scanning the empty hall, but no one was there. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. Then, from the same unseen source, came a chilling reply. "Why did you come here?" My heart raced. The voice wasn't distant anymore. It was right next to me, close enough that I could feel the chill of its breath. "This is private property," I stammered, trying to sound authoritative. "You need to leave." The voice chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that made my skin crawl. "Leave?" It echoed mockingly. "No one leaves, not really." I tightened my grip on my flashlight, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Show yourself." "Are you sure you want to see?" the voice hissed. Before I could respond, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a staircase descending into pitch-black darkness. The cold air wafting from below carried a faint metallic smell, like rust or blood. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I stepped forward. At the bottom of the stairs was a small room filled with rusted tools and rotted crates. The air was suffocating, heavy with an unplaceable tension. A faint scratching noise came from the far corner. I shone my flashlight and froze. A figure crouched there, its back turned to me, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was clawing at the wall, muttering in a language I couldn't understand. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if listening. Slowly it turned. Its face was wrong, stretched and pale. With hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me, it opened its mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Then it suddenly lunged forward, stopping just short of where the light touched the floor. "Why are you here?" it demanded, its voice a guttural snarl. I work here," I stammered. "I'm just the guard." "You don't belong here," it said, its hollow eyes narrowing. "None of you do. This is ours." The whispers began then, a chorus of overlapping voices filling the room. They spoke in a dozen different tones, some pleading, some laughing, others angry. "I don't want trouble," I said, backing toward the stairs. "You brought it with you," the figure said, its head tilting unnaturally to one side. "They always bring it." "What do you mean? Who's they?" I asked, desperate for answers. It grinned, its teeth sharp and too many for its mouth. "You'll find out soon enough. Maybe tonight, maybe later, but you'll know." The whispers grew louder, becoming an unbearable cacophony. I started, but the figure interrupted. "Go." It pointed to the stairs, its grin fading. "Before it's too late." "What happens if I don't?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the whispers. The figure didn't reply. Instead, it stepped back into the darkness, its form dissolving like smoke. But the whispers remained, now louder and angrier. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding as I locked it. But then I noticed something chilling. The drag marks on the floor, leading from the door I had just locked to the opposite end of the hall. The whispers didn't stop. They seemed to follow me as I ran through the warehouse, growing louder with every step. I quit the next morning, but the whispers haven't left me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear them faintly, like they're calling me back. I don't know what they want, and I don't want to find out. But deep down, I know I never really left that warehouse. Not completely. Story 10. It was my third night working the graveyard shift at Blackthorn Island Lodge, a secluded retreat nestled on an island, known for its jagged cliffs and dense fog. Officially, it was a historical site-turned-retreat, but locals whispered that the island held secrets best left undisturbed. The lodge itself was a hulking, Victorian-era building that had seen better days. Most of the staff refused to stay overnight, citing strange occurrences. My job was to oversee security and ensure the guests, a mix of historians and a Gothic literature club, didn't wander into off-limits areas. The night began uneventfully. As the clock struck midnight, I made my rounds. The wind howled outside, rattling the lodge's windows. Passing through the main hall, I saw a man standing near the grand fireplace. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark overcoat and a bowler hat. He held a leather-bound book in one hand, its gold lettering catching the flickering light. "Good evening," I greeted, trying to sound cheerful despite the strange vibe. The man turned slowly. His face was pale, and his eyes seemed sunken, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Good evening," he replied in a deep, measured voice. The past echoes here, does it not? I hesitated. Are you with the historians or the literature group? His lips curved into a faint smile. Neither, I'm merely passing through. Passing through? I frowned. Where are you staying? You're not allowed in this part of the lodge without permission. Instead of answering, he looked toward the east wing, the section of the lodge that had been sealed off for decades due to structural instability. This place remembers, he murmured, almost to himself. What does it remember? I asked, stepping closer. Are you lost? Maybe I can help. He glanced at me, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something shift in his face, like a shadow passing behind his eyes. No one helps, not here. Before I could respond, he walked toward the east wing. Alarmed, I called after him. Sir, that area is closed for safety reasons. You can't go in there. He didn't stop. His footsteps echoed unnaturally in the empty hall. I jogged after him, my flashlight flickering. When I reached the corner where he'd turned, he was gone. The corridor was silent, save for the faint sound of my own breathing. The air was cold, unnaturally so. My flashlight caught movement. A door at the end of the hall was ajar, swaying slightly. The whispers began as I approached, soft and unintelligible at first, then growing louder. Who's there? I called, my voice shaking. Do you really want to know? The voice was directly behind me. I spun around to find the man standing inches away. His pale face was now gaunt, his eyes black pits that seemed to pull the light from the room. I stumbled back, heart pounding. You shouldn't have followed, he said, his voice layered, as though several people were speaking in unison. What are you? I whispered, backing away. He tilted his head, his smile growing wider than seemed possible. I am a memory, a fragment, a keeper of what should be forgotten. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. I don't understand. Forgotten? Forgotten by who? The ones who left. The ones who thought they could escape the weight of their sins? His voice grew colder, each word pressing against me like an unseen force. But you walked willingly into the past. The whispers around us grew deafening, like a chorus of voices crying out in anguish. The man, or whatever he was, stepped closer. Listen carefully, he said, leaning in until his face was mere inches from mine. His breath was icy, carrying the scent of decay. Do you hear them? I nodded, terrified. What do they want? He stared at me for a long moment before whispering, to be set free, or perhaps to take you in their place. A sudden crash echoed from the end of the hall. I turned, breaking his gaze, and saw a shadow dart across the doorway. When I looked back, he was gone. I didn't wait to investigate. Running back to the main hall, I nearly collided with Charlotte, the night manager. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. You saw him, didn't you? She asked. I nodded, still gasping for breath. Who is he? What's happening? Charlotte glanced around nervously before pulling me into the staff lounge. She locked the door behind us and whispered, He's not alive. Not anymore. What do you mean? I demanded. I saw him. He spoke to me. That's not a man, she said, her voice trembling. It's Ezra Blackthorne. He was the lodge's original owner. After his wife vanished, he went mad and started experimenting. They say he tried to open a door to bring her back. A door to what? I asked, dreading the answer. Charlotte hesitated, her voice barely audible. To the other side. Before I could respond, the lights flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers were back, louder and more insistent. A chill swept through the room as a shadow moved across the far wall. Charlotte, I whispered, what do we do? She didn't answer. When I turned to her, she was staring at the shadow, her face frozen in terror. Slowly, the shadow stretched toward her, enveloping her in its inky darkness. Her scream was cut off as the shadow dissolved, leaving nothing behind. I stumbled back, clutching the keys Charlotte had dropped. The whispers grew louder, now joined by faint laughter. Gripping the keys tightly, I ran for the dock, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. When I reached the boat, I looked back. Ezra stood on the shore, his pale face illuminated by the moonlight. His voice carried across the water, low and haunting. You can't leave, not really. As the boat drifted into the fog, the whispers followed me, growing fainter but never truly fading. And when I finally reached the mainland, I found the keys still clutched in my hand. But they were no longer rusted and old. They were polished, gleaming and engraved with a name I didn't recognize.